The night the flashing blue and red lights cut across the quiet Los Angeles streets was unlike anything Meghan Markle could have imagined. Once hailed as a princess of modern times, a symbol of change within one of the world's most secretive monarchies, Meghan found herself at the center of something darker, more sensational, and far more dangerous than a palace whisper. It was no longer about strained relations with the royal family or the cold shoulder from Hollywood's elite. This time, it was police officers in black tactical gear walking up her driveway, knocking on her door with a warrant in hand. And when they stepped inside, the discovery they made would ignite a storm so loud that it threatened to burn down what was left of Meghan's carefully constructed image. Hidden in her private office, beneath folders and piles of neatly stacked papers, they found sketches that would throw her name into an entirely different kind of scandal. These were not ordinary doodles, not amateur designs jotted on a page. They were strikingly identical to unreleased collections from one of the most powerful luxury brands in the world, Balenciaga. The raid itself had the feel of a cinematic climax, a moment the media would replay in slow motion for days to come. Neighbors peered out from their windows, trying to catch a glimpse of what was happening. Paparazzi, always circling the couple's Montecito home like vultures, captured the chaos from afar, long lenses zooming in to catch glimpses of uniforms, cardboard evidence boxes, and Meghan herself briefly silhouetted against the window before the curtains were drawn shut. The whispers started immediately. Why would the police be raiding Meghan Markle's home? For months, her public presence had been marred by controversies ranging from alleged lies about her pregnancies to Hollywood doors closing on her ambitions. But fashion theft? That was new. That was shocking. And it would capture the imagination of the world in a way few scandals could. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The beginning of the story was simple enough to recount, but explosive in implication. According to sources close to the investigation, officers had been tipped off about intellectual property theft in the high-stakes world of fashion. Balenciaga, a brand infamous for pushing boundaries, was reportedly preparing a new line of designs that had been tightly guarded in secrecy. Yet somehow, pieces of those designs, unreleased, unseen by the public, had surfaced in sketches discovered during this raid. Hidden not in some designer's loft, not in a shady backroom of a counterfeit ring, but in the private home office of the Duchess of Sussex herself. It was a discovery that went beyond ordinary celebrity scandal. This was not about reputation alone. It was about possible crimes, lawsuits, and a betrayal of trust on an industrial scale. The middle of the introduction is where the tension deepens, and the audience begins to understand the stakes. Meghan Markle had long flirted with the fashion industry. From her days on the red carpet during her acting career to her carefully curated outfits as a royal, and later, her attempts to step into the world of lifestyle branding with projects like archetypes and rumored product lines, fashion had always been part of her identity. Critics claimed she viewed clothes as armor, tools to craft her narrative and maintain control over how the world saw her. Supporters admired her choices, praising her as a modern style icon. But what lay beneath the surface was a different story, a hunger not just to wear the clothes, but to create them, to stamp her name in an industry dominated by legacy houses and global power players. When officers revealed what they had found, the whispers about Meghan's ambitions crystallized into damning accusations. Was she preparing to launch her own fashion line? Was she positioning herself as the face of a brand that could rival even Balenciaga itself? And most crucially, if those sketches were indeed identical to Balenciaga's unreleased work, how had they ended up in her possession? This was the question that cut deeper than any gossip column or tabloid headline. To the fashion world, intellectual property theft is not just embarrassing, it's catastrophic. Brands spend millions to protect their ideas before unveiling them on runways. A leak could ruin an entire collection, damage the brand's market edge, and cost them millions in revenue. For Meghan to be tied to something of this magnitude was not just scandalous, it was potentially ruinous. The press wasted no time in painting the discovery in vivid colors. Headlines screamed of a raid, a betrayal, and sketches smuggled from the vaults of one of the most secretive fashion houses in the world. Some claimed Meghan had long envied the status of fashion icons who transcended celebrity into mogul status, Names like Victoria Beckham or Kim Kardashian, women who built empires on their style. Was this raid proof that Meghan wanted the same, but had chosen the wrong path to achieve it? Or was she being framed, yet again, as part of a conspiracy to tear her down? This ambiguity is what made the story so captivating. It wasn't just a black and white scandal. It was a maze of possibilities, each one darker than the last. And then there was Harry. For years, he had positioned himself as Meghan's fiercest defender, the man who left behind his royal title, his military life, and his homeland to protect her from the forces he saw as destructive. But this raid placed him in a corner no public statement could easily defend. What happens when your wife is not just accused of lying or manipulating the press, but of being caught with evidence that ties her to one of the most scandalous forms of theft in fashion? Sources reported that Harry looked visibly shaken as he left the house that evening, avoiding cameras, his jaw tight, his eyes low. To the public, that image alone said more than any statement ever could. This scandal was not just about Meghan. It was about both of them, and about the life they had chosen to build outside the royal family's walls. As the introduction draws toward its end, the stage is set for the deeper story that will unfold. On one hand, there is Meghan Markle, a woman who has long been painted as both a victim and a villain, depending on who tells the story. On the other, there is the undeniable fact of those sketches, those prototypes that investigators reportedly packed into boxes and carried out of her home under the harsh glare of paparazzi flashbulbs. The world is left to wonder, is Meghan truly guilty of attempting to launch a copycat fashion empire on the back of stolen designs? Or is this yet another orchestrated scandal, one more chapter in a saga designed to break her? The introduction leaves us not with answers, but with questions. Who leaked the tip that led police to her door? How did sketches that mirrored Balenciaga's closely guarded secrets find their way into her office? Was this a desperate attempt at reinvention gone wrong, or the carefully laid trap of an industry that has never fully welcomed her? As the audience prepares to dive deeper, one truth becomes clear. This is not a simple story of right and wrong. It is a tale of power, ambition, betrayal, and the high price of trying to carve out an empire in a world that feeds on scandal. This is where the narrative pauses, leaving the viewer on edge, aware that the chapters ahead will peel back the layers of this raid, the designs, the fallout, and the devastating impact it may have not only on Meghan but on the monarchy she once left behind. The raid that shook the world did not unfold quietly in the background like some minor incident that could later be brushed off. It erupted in a way that demanded attention from the moment the first police car rolled onto the driveway. Neighbors would later say they had never seen anything like it, not even in Hollywood, where celebrity scandals often turn suburban neighborhoods into circus arenas. The sound of heavy boots on pavement, the sharp knock on Meghan and Harry's front door, and the commanding voices of officers announcing their presence created an atmosphere of dread that spread beyond the house itself. To the world outside, this was the moment where all the whispers about Meghan Markle, all the controversies and rumors that had trailed her since she first stepped into the royal spotlight, became something tangible, something that could no longer be ignored. Eyewitness accounts paint a vivid picture of the atmosphere that night. The police arrived just after sunset, when the Montecito sky still carried the glow of fading light, but the streets were already beginning to quiet. The convoy of black and white vehicles, their sirens off but lights flashing, snaked its way down the exclusive lane lined with mansions belonging to billionaires, actors, and tech moguls. The presence of law enforcement in that serene enclave sent a ripple of unease through the community. One resident, speaking under anonymity, described how people instinctively pulled back their curtains, torn between curiosity and the fear of being caught staring. But curiosity won. Almost every household was watching as the police descended upon the Sussexes' property. The first shock came when the officers produced a warrant. Meghan, by all accounts, appeared stunned but tried to maintain composure. Harry, visibly unsettled, seemed caught between disbelief and rage. This was not some paparazzi ambush or tabloid fabrication. They were facing official investigators. When the officers stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted. What began as disbelief hardened into a spectacle that neighbors and cameras alike would not soon forget. The entry into the house was professional, quiet, and methodical, But what followed felt explosive. Teams of officers moved swiftly through the hallways and into the private office where Meghan reportedly conducted much of her work. That office, which insiders once described as her sanctuary filled with vision boards, laptops, books, and binders, was about to become the centerpiece of one of the most bizarre raids in celebrity history. Within minutes, officers began pulling out folders and sketch pads. Some items were tucked neatly into drawers, others hidden beneath stacks of documents. Witnesses claimed the officers' demeanor changed once the first sketches were found. What had seemed like a routine search now looked like a bombshell discovery. They moved with urgency, photographing, cataloging, and carefully placing the items into evidence bags. The word that spread quickly, sketches resembling Balenciaga's unreleased designs, was almost too sensational to believe. How could Meghan Markle, who had once spoken about empowerment, humanitarian causes, and building a legacy beyond the crown, be implicated in something that sounded more like a high-stakes fashion crime thriller than real life? Yet the evidence boxes leaving her home told their own story. Each container carried the weight of questions that could not be brushed aside with a press release or carefully managed interview. The media storm broke within hours. Paparazzi footage captured officers hauling evidence boxes down the driveway, their stark white labels gleaming under the flash of cameras. Those images raced across social media platforms and news outlets before Meghan or Harry could even think of a response. Twitter hashtags trended worldwide within minutes. Hashtag Meghan Raid, hashtag Balenciaga Scandal, hashtag Royal Shame. Memes appeared almost instantly, some mocking her alleged ambitions to launch her own fashion empire, others speculating on the downfall of what many had once called the fairy tale couple. But behind the sensational headlines, deeper questions emerged. Why Balenciaga? Why now? Sources claimed that the brand had been preparing to unveil a collection that was one of its most closely guarded secrets. In the ruthless world of fashion, where millions of dollars rest on the surprise and exclusivity of new designs, leaks are catastrophic. If those sketches in Meghan's office truly mirrored Balenciaga's upcoming line, the consequences were staggering. Investigators reportedly worked in coordination with private fashion industry watchdogs who had already been tracking possible leaks. The tip-off that led to Meghan's home was shrouded in mystery, with some insiders suggesting that Balenciaga itself had been monitoring unusual movements of its intellectual property. Others whispered that a disgruntled insider from Meghan's circle may have betrayed her, leaking information to authorities as revenge or leverage. What is clear is that the raid was not random. It was the result of a focused investigation that ended on Meghan's doorstep. The atmosphere that followed the raid was one of global shock. For Meghan's critics, it felt like vindication. They had long accused her of being opportunistic, ambitious to the point of recklessness, someone who wanted to stand shoulder to shoulder with the world's elite without paying the dues required. To them, this raid was proof that the mask had slipped. For her supporters, however, it was another chapter in what they viewed as a relentless campaign to discredit her. How convenient, they argued, that just as Meghan was rumored to be preparing a new business venture, she was suddenly tied to a scandal of this magnitude. Was she really guilty, or was this yet another example of her being targeted? The raid also exposed a fascinating clash of cultures. On one side was Meghan, a former actress and royal who had already faced a decade of relentless public scrutiny. On the other side was the fashion world, a place notorious for protecting its designs with near-paranoid intensity. Balenciaga, in particular, had built a reputation for being fiercely protective of its creative process. To be accused of stealing from them was akin to declaring war in an industry where reputation is everything. The most gripping part of this first chapter is not simply that Meghan's home was raided, but that the raid instantly shifted the narrative surrounding her life. Until that moment, her scandals had largely been confined to disputes with the royal family, accusations of lies, or professional missteps in Hollywood. This was different. This was not family drama or public relations gone wrong. It was a criminal investigation with real consequences. The discovery of sketches tied her not just to controversy, but to the kind of allegations that could destroy careers and reputations permanently. And then there was Harry. His presence during the raid was symbolic. Once a prince who had promised to protect Meghan against the onslaught of media attacks, he now stood powerless as police combed through their belongings. To the watching world, his silence, his grim expressions, and his refusal to make any public statement in the immediate aftermath spoke volumes. The fairy tale romance that had once captivated millions was now being framed by flashing police lights and evidence bags. By the end of that night, the world had already drawn its own conclusions. Whether Meghan was guilty or innocent, the damage was done. The image of law enforcement carrying boxes out of her home was too powerful to be forgotten. It became the defining image of the raid, one that would play again and again in news broadcasts, documentaries, and social media debates. This was the moment the story shifted from whispers to hard reality. This was the moment Meghan Markle's name became tied not just to gossip, but to the possibility of real legal jeopardy. The raid itself, its drama, its visuals, its immediate fallout. This was the opening act of a scandal that would dominate headlines and challenge everything Meghan had fought to build since leaving the royal family. The discovery of the hidden sketches was the turning point of the raid, the moment that transformed an ordinary search into an international scandal. Officers moved carefully, combing through Meghan's office with trained precision, while the air inside the Montecito mansion grew heavy with tension. According to reports, the sketches were not lying in plain sight. They were deliberately tucked away, concealed beneath layers of personal papers and files. The placement suggested secrecy, not casual oversight. When one officer pulled out a thick folder from a drawer and flipped it open, the room reportedly fell silent. What they saw were fashion illustrations of a professional caliber, sleek, bold, and avant-garde. But these were not just any designs. They bore uncanny similarities to unreleased Balenciaga prototypes that, until then, had been guarded with near-obsessive secrecy by the brand. The sketches were not simple outlines either. They included detailed notes, fabric swatches attached with pins, and color schemes that matched whispers of Balenciaga's upcoming line. Some pages even contained technical drawings and construction details that only someone with insider access would normally possess. Investigators immediately recognized the weight of what they had uncovered. These were not harmless doodles or mood boards compiled by a fashion enthusiast. They were blueprints for clothing that had not yet been revealed to the world, clothing tied to one of the most powerful names in the luxury industry. The evidence was damning. The strangeness of the situation only deepened when prototypes were discovered alongside the sketches. Hidden in garment bags stored discreetly at the back of the office closet were sample pieces. Unfinished, but unmistakably resembling Balenciaga's signature aesthetic. They bore details too precise to be accidental, stitching patterns, silhouettes, and structural innovations that matched the house's upcoming collection. For the officers on scene, this was no longer a speculative investigation. This was a direct clash between a globally recognized duchess and the sanctity of intellectual property in high fashion. The question that immediately began swirling was how Meghan had obtained these designs in the first place. Balenciaga, like most luxury brands, operates under intense confidentiality. Access to unreleased collections is restricted to a small circle of trusted insiders. Sketches are locked away in secure studios, prototypes tracked meticulously. To see these designs turn up in a private home thousands of miles away from the brand's headquarters was almost unthinkable. Did Meghan have an insider feeding her information? Was this the work of corporate espionage, or had she somehow manipulated her connections to gain access to closely guarded material? Speculation ran rampant. Some argued that Meghan had been working with a disgruntled Balenciaga employee who provided her with the designs in exchange for money or influence. Others suggested that she had hired freelance designers who themselves had stolen the sketches from the fashion house. There were even whispers of hacking, claims that digital files could have been leaked, printed, and then reimagined in Meghan's office as part of a larger strategy to create a competing line. No matter the theory, the underlying question remained the same. Why were those designs in her possession? The discovery of the sketches instantly fueled accusations that Meghan had been planning a secret fashion line. For months, rumors had circulated that she wanted to step into the industry not just as a wearer of clothes, but as a creator, a brand owner. She had been seen meeting with stylists, designers, and investors, sparking speculation that she was preparing to launch a luxury label. Those rumors had seemed harmless enough at first, another chapter in her post-royal reinvention. But now, with Balenciaga sketches allegedly found in her office, those whispers took on a darker meaning. Instead of admiration for ambition, there was outrage at what many perceived as theft. The emotional weight of this discovery cannot be understated. To the public, fashion may appear glamorous, even frivolous, but within the industry, designs are lifeblood. Each sketch represents months of creative labor, intellectual property worth millions. For Meghan to be tied to sketches that appeared to mirror Balenciaga's unreleased collection was not just scandalous, it was catastrophic. It made her look not like a visionary entrepreneur, but a copycat willing to take shortcuts to achieve her ambitions. Experts in the fashion world began weighing in almost immediately. Prominent designers, speaking anonymously, expressed disbelief. One said the similarity between the seized sketches and Balenciaga's upcoming line was too precise to be coincidental. Another explained how such leaks could devastate a brand, forcing them to scrap entire collections to protect exclusivity. Some even claimed Meghan's alleged actions could amount to corporate sabotage. For them, this wasn't about celebrity gossip. It was about protecting the sanctity of creative work. But while the fashion community reacted with shock and anger, Meghan's defenders painted a different picture. They argued that having sketches in her office did not necessarily mean she had stolen them. Perhaps they were simply inspiration boards compiled by overzealous assistants. Perhaps someone had planted the sketches deliberately to frame her. The idea that Meghan was once again being targeted by powerful forces gained traction among her most loyal supporters. They saw the raid as yet another example of her being silenced, punished for daring to break into industries dominated by legacy families and entrenched elites. What added fuel to the fire was the secrecy surrounding the prototypes. Photographs from the raid, leaked to the press, showed evidence bags containing clothing items that were partially blurred by investigators. The fact that these pieces were whisked away before anyone outside law enforcement could examine them left room for speculation. Were they truly Balenciaga prototypes, or garments that only vaguely resembled the brand's style? The lack of transparency made the scandal even more explosive, as people filled the void with their own assumptions and suspicions. Inside the house, the discovery of the sketches and prototypes was reportedly devastating for Harry. Witnesses said his face drained of color as the evidence was carried out. For a man who had spent years framing himself as a protector of his wife against what he called systemic persecution, watching her implicated in something so concrete and damaging must have been unbearable. He stood in the background, his shoulders slumped, while Meghan tried to argue with officers about the seizure. Her protests, according to those present, were firm but strained. She insisted the sketches were personal work, not stolen property. But her words carried little weight as the evidence disappeared into police vehicles. The fallout from the discovery was immediate and brutal. By the next morning, newspapers across the world carried headlines about Meghan's secret stash and copycat designs. Television panels debated whether this was the final undoing of the Duchess, while fashion critics dissected every blurry photo of the seized sketches, comparing them to Balenciaga's past collections to highlight similarities. Social media became a battleground of memes, outrage, and conspiracy theories. For Meghan, the court of public opinion was already in session, and the evidence against her was on full display. What made the situation even more volatile was that Balenciaga itself remained largely silent in the hours after the raid. The lack of an official statement from the brand allowed speculation to spiral. Some took the silence as confirmation that the sketches were authentic, proof that the fashion house was preparing a lawsuit. Others suggested the silence was strategic, that Balenciaga wanted to avoid being dragged into Meghan's tabloid drama. Whatever the reason, their lack of comment amplified the scandal rather than diminished it. By the end of the week, the discovery of the hidden sketches had done more than damage Meghan's image. It had raised fundamental questions about her future. Could she recover from a scandal this tangible, this visual? Was there any path back to credibility when evidence bags bearing her name had been photographed leaving her home? The sketches were no longer just drawings. They were symbols of betrayal, ambition, and the thin line between aspiration and crime. The narrative was set. Meghan Markle, once hailed as a modernizing force within the royal family, now stood accused of being at the center of one of the most shocking fashion scandals of the decade. Whether guilty or innocent, the discovery of those sketches ensured that the world would never see her the same way again. Meghan's relationship with fashion had always been one of her defining traits, a tool she wielded with precision in crafting her public persona. From the earliest days of her acting career, she understood the power of clothing not only to flatter, but to communicate. On the red carpet, she chose elegant gowns that exuded sophistication. At charity events, she dressed with a casual chicness that suggested both accessibility and refinement. When she stepped into the global spotlight as Prince Harry's partner, her wardrobe choices were scrutinized with the kind of intensity usually reserved for heads of state. Every hemline, every fabric, every designer she wore became a statement, whether she intended it to be or not. It was no surprise, then, that whispers of her having secret ambitions to launch a fashion line had circulated for years. Those whispers became louder after the royal exit. Without the constraints of royal protocol, Meghan was free to pursue projects that once might have been frowned upon by Palisades. Her Archwell brand, her media deals, and her podcast suggested a desire to become a powerhouse in industries where influence meant more than titles. But behind the scenes, insiders claimed she had her eyes on something more glamorous, more lucrative, and more enduring than fleeting media contracts. A fashion empire with her name attached to it. In the months leading up to the raid, subtle signs pointed to Meghan testing the waters of this dream. She had reportedly been meeting with stylists and consultants, people known for their roles in developing celebrity fashion brands. She was also rumored to have hired a small team of assistants tasked with researching luxury markets, analyzing consumer behavior, and scouting potential investors. Friends said Meghan often spoke of wanting to create something that would outlast her public controversies, a legacy brand that could stand on its own, divorced from her royal connections or tabloid headlines. She imagined herself as a visionary, someone who could combine the glamour of Hollywood with the sophistication of European fashion houses. This desire was not unprecedented. Meghan had long admired women like Victoria Beckham, who had successfully transitioned from pop star to respected designer. She also looked at figures like Kim Kardashian, who leveraged fame into billion-dollar fashion and beauty empires. Meghan, critics claimed, wanted that same trajectory. She no longer wanted to be defined as Harry's wife or the outsider royal. She wanted to be seen as a global mogul in her own right. And to do that, fashion seemed the perfect avenue. The problem, however, was that creating a fashion line from scratch is a monumental undertaking. It requires not only vision but also industry credibility, deep financial backing, and a team of skilled creatives. For Meghan, the credibility part was always shaky. To her supporters, she was stylish and trend-setting. To her critics, she was derivative, relying heavily on designers to craft her look rather than displaying any true sense of originality. These criticisms made her rumored ambitions to launch a label all the more controversial. Was she truly capable of leading a fashion empire, or was this just another example of her chasing prestige without earning it? The discovery of the Balenciaga sketches gave these questions new urgency. To many, the evidence suggested that Meghan was indeed trying to shortcut her way into the industry. Instead of building a design house from the ground up, she was allegedly piggybacking on the ideas of one of the most innovative brands in the world. The implication was damning. Meghan's dream of launching a line was not built on creativity, but on appropriation. But to understand Meghan's alleged motivations, one must look at the psychological and emotional roots of her relationship with fashion. Growing up, she was acutely aware of the role appearances played in social mobility. Her carefully curated outfits during her acting career were not simply choices of style. They were calculated efforts to gain entry into rooms where image mattered as much as talent. Later, as a royal, her wardrobe was used as both shield and weapon, a way to navigate the cold, judgmental corridors of the monarchy. Clothing became, for Meghan, not just fabric but armor, a way of asserting control in environments where she often felt powerless. Launching her own line would not only be financially rewarding, but also deeply symbolic. It would be the ultimate form of control, a way to dictate not only how she was perceived, but also how others dressed in her vision. Supporters argued that Meghan had every right to pursue such ambitions. After all, Countless celebrities had entered fashion with varying degrees of experience. Why should Meghan be held to a harsher standard? Why should she not be allowed to parlay her fame into a brand? They painted her as a woman unfairly targeted, someone whose every move was scrutinized in ways others never faced. To them, the whispers of her secret fashion dreams were simply another example of her being vilified for doing what countless others in her position had done. But her critics saw it differently. They claimed Meghan was obsessed with status, with attaching herself to industries that symbolized power and wealth. To them, her alleged pursuit of a fashion line was not about creativity or vision, it was about ego. They pointed to her past controversies, arguing that the raid revealed her true intentions. She was willing to bend rules, even steal, to achieve the image of success she craved. For them, the hidden sketches were proof that Meghan's ambitions had crossed into dangerous territory. What made the situation even more fascinating was the timing. The fashion industry, reeling from global shifts and scandals of its own, was both vulnerable and fiercely protective. For Meghan to allegedly attempt to infiltrate it with stolen designs seemed reckless, even suicidal, for her brand. Yet some insiders speculated that desperation may have driven her. Hollywood had cooled on her after initial excitement. Her media projects had faced setbacks, and public sympathy had waned. Launching a fashion empire, if successful, could have restored her relevance. Was the raid evidence of a desperate gamble gone wrong? In the days after the sketches were revealed, speculation about Meghan's secret dreams became more fevered. Reports surfaced that she had been quietly registering trademarks linked to lifestyle and fashion. Analysts dug into filings and found names associated with clothing, jewelry, and accessories. This fueled claims that Meghan was closer than anyone realized to unveiling her brand. To her critics, this was the smoking gun. To her defenders, it was proof she was serious about building something legitimate, and that the scandal around the sketches was a carefully timed attempt to derail her. Harry's role in all this cannot be ignored. Friends of the couple suggested he was supportive of Meghan's ambitions, but wary of the risks. He knew the scrutiny they lived under and likely feared that any misstep would be magnified. Watching her dreams crash under the weight of a police raid and accusations of theft must have been crushing. Some claimed Harry begged her to reconsider, to slow down, to build credibility before launching into such a competitive space. But Meghan, driven by a need to prove herself, pressed on. The dream of fashion, then, was not just a business idea. It was a personal quest for validation, independence, and power. The raid, the sketches, the accusations, they all exposed not just the practical risks but the deeper emotional stakes of Meghan's ambitions. Whether she was guilty of theft or a victim of circumstance, one thing became undeniable. Meghan Markle had set her sights on fashion as the stage for her next act. And now, that dream stood at the center of a storm powerful enough to destroy everything she had tried to build. The chapter closes with a sense of tragic inevitability. Meghan's secret fashion dreams, once whispered with excitement and speculation, were now shouted across headlines as evidence of greed, ambition, or betrayal. For some, she remained a woman unfairly punished for dreaming too boldly. For others, she was a cautionary tale of what happens when ambition turns reckless. The discovery of the sketches had transformed her private aspirations into a public scandal, and whether her empire would rise or fall was a question the world was now eager to see answered. Balenciaga's silence in the immediate aftermath of the raid was almost as deafening as the flashing headlines that had spread across the globe. For an industry giant that thrives on attention, secrecy, and spectacle, the absence of a clear statement was interpreted by many as both ominous and deliberate. The brand's refusal to confirm or deny anything in those critical first hours created a vacuum, one that the media and public quickly filled with speculation. People asked themselves why Balenciaga, known for being aggressively protective of its intellectual property, was not speaking up. Was it because the evidence truly tied Meghan to their unreleased designs, and they were preparing a calculated legal response? Or was it because the scandal itself was so toxic that even Balenciaga didn't want to be seen pouring gasoline on a fire already burning out of control? The fashion house had long built its reputation not only on pushing creative boundaries, but also on its ability to guard secrets. Collections were hidden until the moment of reveal, invitations to shows were shrouded in exclusivity, and leaks were treated as betrayals worthy of severe consequences. To discover that unreleased designs had allegedly surfaced in Meghan Markle's private office struck at the very heart of Balenciaga's brand identity. Within the industry, silence often speaks louder than words, and insiders recognized that Balenciaga's reluctance to respond immediately could only mean one thing. The situation was being studied with surgical precision. Lawyers, executives, and designers were likely locked in urgent meetings, poring over the details of the raid, assessing the evidence, and calculating their next move. Behind closed doors, those meetings must have been tense. For Balenciaga, the raid posed a dilemma. On one hand, acknowledging that their designs had been compromised risked confirming a catastrophic leak, undermining their reputation for control. On the other hand, ignoring or downplaying the situation could make them appear weak, as though one of the most closely guarded brands in fashion had been infiltrated by a former royal turned celebrity entrepreneur. In the cutthroat world of luxury fashion, perception is everything. The question Balenciaga faced was not just whether Meghan Markle had their designs, but what admitting that fact would do to their carefully constructed aura of invincibility. The silence also sparked wild theories. Some believe Balenciaga had already known about the leak and had quietly coordinated with authorities to trap Meghan in the act, allowing the police raid to unfold without the brand's direct involvement in public. Others suspected the silence meant Balenciaga was scrambling behind the scenes, unsure of how so sensitive a situation had slipped through their control. Still others speculated that the brand's executives feared the scandal might damage their own image if they were perceived as victims of theft. In an industry where weakness is dangerous, being seen as a brand that had been outmaneuvered could have consequences far beyond a single collection. The suspicion deepened when fashion insiders began whispering that Balenciaga had indeed noticed irregularities in their security weeks before the raid. According to anonymous sources, there were concerns that sketches had been copied or leaked, though no one could identify the culprit. Some insiders pointed to the growing prevalence of cyber espionage in the fashion world, with hackers targeting design databases in hopes of selling information to counterfeiters or competitors. If Meghan somehow ended up with sketches, did this mean she was a beneficiary of such a breach, or had she orchestrated it? The silence from Balenciaga gave no clarity, only fueling speculation. The silence also sparked wild theories. Some believe Balenciaga had already known about the leak and had quietly coordinated with authorities to trap Meghan in the act, allowing the police raid to unfold without the brand's direct involvement in public. Others suspected the silence meant Balenciaga was scrambling behind the scenes, unsure of how so sensitive a situation had slipped through their control. Still others speculated that the brand's executives feared the scandal might damage their own image if they were perceived as victims of theft. In an industry where weakness is dangerous, being seen as a brand that had been outmaneuvered could have consequences far beyond a single collection. The suspicion deepened when fashion insiders began whispering that Balenciaga had indeed noticed irregularities in their security weeks before the raid. According to anonymous sources, there were concerns that sketches had been copied or leaked, though no one could identify the culprit. Some insiders pointed to the growing prevalence of cyber espionage in the fashion world, with hackers targeting design databases in hopes of selling information to counterfeiters or competitors. If Meghan somehow ended up with sketches, did this mean she was a beneficiary of such a breach, or had she orchestrated it? The silence from Balenciaga gave no clarity, only fueling speculation. Observers also noted that Balenciaga's leadership was in a precarious position. The brand had weathered controversies before, including marketing scandals that drew public outrage. To be linked now to a global tabloid storm involving Meghan Markle threatened to drag them into a different kind of narrative, one that mixed celebrity gossip with allegations of theft. Some executives likely feared that even acknowledging Meghan publicly could make the brand part of a media circus. For a house that prided itself on maintaining elite distance, being splashed across tabloids alongside the Duchess of Sussex was a nightmare scenario. The longer Balenciaga remained silent, the more the world filled in the blanks. Analysts dissected every possible angle. Was Balenciaga preparing a lawsuit? Were they negotiating privately with Meghan's team? Was the silence evidence of guilt on Meghan's part, or hesitation on Balenciaga's? Legal experts weighed in on television panels, explaining how intellectual property disputes in fashion are notoriously complex, often resolved behind the scenes with settlements rather than court cases. But they also noted that if Meghan was indeed found with unreleased designs, Balenciaga could make an example out of her. By pursuing legal action, they could send a message to the entire industry that even the most famous names were not immune to the consequences of theft. Fashion critics also speculated on the creative side of the scandal. If those sketches and prototypes truly mirrored Balenciaga's upcoming collection, what would the brand do? Would they scrap months of work to protect exclusivity, or proceed with the designs and risk being accused of copying Meghan if she managed to launch something first? The silence suggested the brand was weighing these options carefully, calculating the financial and reputational costs of each path. To scrap a collection would mean millions lost, but to go forward could mean years of defending their originality in the shadow of Meghan's scandal. For Meghan's detractors, Balenciaga's silence was damning. They interpreted it as confirmation that the brand had indeed been wronged, and that they were preparing to strike hard. For her supporters, however, the silence provided hope. If Balenciaga had truly been wronged, why wouldn't they immediately denounce her? Why wouldn't they issue a statement condemning the theft? To them, the silence was evidence that perhaps the raid had been exaggerated, that maybe the sketches were not as damning as reported. In the polarized court of public opinion, silence became a canvas on which each side painted its own narrative. Within fashion circles, however, there was no such ambiguity. Insiders whispered that Balenciaga's silence was strategic, not indecisive. They were said to be gathering evidence, consulting lawyers, and planning a response that would be devastating when it finally came. The suspicion that Meghan had attempted to replicate their designs was treated as sacrilege, an act of arrogance that demanded a public reckoning. To steal from Balenciaga, even allegedly, was not just to risk a lawsuit. It was to invite exile from the inner sanctum of high fashion. Meanwhile, Meghan's team reportedly scrambled to interpret the silence as well. For them, it was a waiting game filled with dread. Every hour that Balenciaga said nothing was another hour of uncertainty, another moment where her reputation teetered on the edge of destruction. Should they issue a preemptive statement? Should they claim the sketches were harmless, or deny they existed at all? The silence of Balenciaga forced Meghan into her own silence, leaving the world to speculate endlessly without interruption. The suspicion surrounding Balenciaga's lack of comment grew so intense that it began to dominate the scandal itself. The raid had been shocking, the sketches damning, but what truly unsettled the world was the sense that something bigger was being orchestrated behind the scenes. Balenciaga's silence felt less like absence and more like the pause before a storm. When, if ever, they chose to speak, it was expected to be seismic. This chapter closes with the recognition that silence, in this case, was not neutrality. It was strategy. Balenciaga's refusal to enter the media circus immediately after the raid allowed them to control the narrative by not feeding it. But that same silence also magnified suspicion, making the scandal bigger, darker, and more mysterious. Whether Meghan was guilty or not, whether the sketches were authentic or planted, one fact was undeniable. Balenciaga's silence became the loudest voice in the room, echoing across the fashion world and beyond. The moment the raid revealed those sketches and prototypes, the world of fashion and media wasted no time in branding Meghan with a word that can tarnish reputations beyond repair: copycat. The accusations spread like wildfire, fueled by images of evidence bags, blurred prototypes, and descriptions from anonymous insiders who claimed the designs were unmistakably Balenciaga's. Copycat, a label that, in fashion, is more than an insult. It is the equivalent of intellectual treason. Designers live and die by their originality, and to be accused of stealing ideas is to be accused of undermining the very foundation of creativity. For Meghan, the narrative quickly shifted from curiosity to condemnation. Was she preparing to release a collection that had been borrowed, piece by piece, from a house that had defined avant-garde luxury for decades? The accusations carried weight because they were so easy to visualize. Balenciaga's aesthetic is distinctive: oversized silhouettes, daring experimentation with form, and a balance of streetwear influence with haute couture. When the public heard that sketches resembling Balenciaga's unreleased collection were found in Meghan's office, it wasn't difficult to imagine her attempting to pass them off as her own. Critics lined up to accuse her of trying to shortcut her way into an industry where others had sacrificed years of sweat and sleepless nights for originality. Instead of climbing the ladder slowly, they said, she had tried to leap to the top by copying the work of one of the most fearless brands in the business. Commentators on talk shows compared the alleged sketches with Balenciaga's past collections, drawing out similarities and painting scenarios of how Meghan's supposed line could have been launched under the guise of innovation. The word plagiarism began to circulate. Intellectual property theft was invoked repeatedly, and the idea of Meghan as a creative visionary was replaced by a darker image. Meghan as a scavenger, someone looking to stitch her name onto the work of others. The copycat accusations hurt most because they touched the very core of Meghan's public persona. She had spent years carefully presenting herself as unique, as someone breaking molds, challenging traditions, and refusing to conform. Her style had always been used to support that image, modern, understated, yet assertive. But if her fashion ambitions were tainted with charges of mimicry, the authenticity she had cultivated would crumble. A person who builds their reputation on originality cannot afford to be accused of stealing it. As the accusations spread, so did comparisons to other celebrity ventures. Victoria Beckham's entry into fashion had been met with skepticism at first, but she won critics over by proving her originality and discipline. Kim Kardashian, though mocked at first, built an empire on shapewear innovations that carved out a unique niche. Meghan's alleged attempt, in contrast, looked like a fast track that backfired spectacularly. Instead of developing a niche or identity of her own, critics claimed she had leaned on Balenciaga's work, hoping her fame could mask the theft. The comparisons were brutal, and they framed Meghan not as a trailblazer, but as a pretender in an industry that values authenticity above all else. Fashion insiders added fuel by speaking on background to reporters. One prominent designer, though unwilling to be named, said that if the sketches were indeed Balenciaga's, then Meghan's plan was nothing short of catastrophic. Another insider explained that such acts are considered the gravest form of disrespect in the industry, likening it to stealing someone's diary and publishing it under your own name. The language used was emotional, painting the alleged act not just as business theft, but as a betrayal of artistry itself. Public opinion divided sharply. Meghan's critics saw the copycat accusations as confirmation of what they had always believed, that she was obsessed with image, willing to use others' work to maintain her status. They argued that she had always been more concerned with appearances than substance, and now, with the sketches discovered, she was finally exposed. For them, the scandal was a moment of vindication. Her supporters, however, clung to the possibility that the accusations were exaggerated or fabricated. They argued that resemblance is common in fashion, where trends overlap and ideas often echo each other unintentionally. They insisted that the discovery of sketches in Meghan's office did not prove theft. Perhaps they were fan-made illustrations, perhaps references collected for inspiration, or even planted evidence. To them, the copycat narrative was simply another weapon used to destroy her reputation. They pointed out that Meghan's every move had been twisted by critics for years, and this was just the latest example of piling on. Yet the damage of the accusations was undeniable. Fashion thrives on perception, and once the word copycat attaches itself to a name, it is nearly impossible to shake. The industry has long memories, and accusations of theft can follow someone for decades. Even if Meghan were to clear her name, the stain of suspicion would linger, shadowing any future attempts at entering fashion. Investors, collaborators, and designers would think twice before attaching themselves to someone accused of copying Balenciaga. The risk of association alone would be enough to deter many. The story became more complicated when whispers emerged that Meghan had allegedly been preparing for a soft launch of her fashion line within the next year. Trademark filings, combined with her meetings with consultants, suggested she was building momentum. If true, this meant the sketches and prototypes were not simply idle fantasies. They were building blocks for a real business. The accusations of copycatting, then, became even more serious. If she had gone forward and unveiled a line that mirrored Balenciaga's designs, the backlash would have been explosive, both legally and publicly. For Harry, the copycat accusations were another crushing blow. Watching his wife branded with such a devastating label must have been humiliating. He had fought for years against what he saw as unfair persecution, framing Meghan as a victim of a cruel press. But how could he spin accusations backed by sketches, prototypes, and a police raid? His silence only fueled speculation. To the public, his lack of defense seemed like quiet acknowledgement of guilt. To others, it was proof of a man caught between love and the crushing weight of evidence. The accusations also reverberated back to the royal family. While the palace refused to comment publicly, insiders whispered about the embarrassment. For a monarchy that prizes tradition, legacy, and reputation, the idea of a former royal duchess accused of stealing designs from Balenciaga was mortifying. It reinforced their narrative that Harry and Meghan had chosen a reckless, unstable path. In the royal halls, the copycat accusations were seen not just as Meghan's scandal, but as a stain on the institution that had once embraced her. The copycat narrative thrived because it fit into broader public skepticism about Meghan. For years, critics had called her manipulative, ambitious, and self-serving. The raid and discovery of sketches seemed to confirm those suspicions. Copycat was more than just a description of alleged theft. It became a metaphor for how her detractors saw her entire public life. To them, she had copied the royal playbook, copied the strategies of celebrity entrepreneurs, and now, allegedly, copied the designs of Balenciaga. The word echoed across tabloids, talk shows, and social media, cementing itself as the defining label of the scandal. By the end of the week, the accusations had gained so much traction that Meghan's team faced a nearly impossible task. Denials sounded weak against the vivid imagery of sketches in evidence bags. Claims of innocence were drowned out by memes and headlines mocking her alleged attempt at passing off stolen work as her own. The narrative was out of her control, and the damage was spreading faster than she could contain. This chapter leaves Meghan in a precarious position, branded with an accusation that could destroy her ambitions before they ever had a chance to materialize. Whether she had genuinely planned to copy Balenciaga or had simply been caught in a storm of coincidence and malice, the word copycat now defined her in the eyes of millions. And in fashion, where originality is currency, being called a copycat is a sentence from which few ever recover. Prince Harry's dilemma in the wake of the raid and the copycat accusations was perhaps the most human and heartbreaking element of the entire scandal. For years, he had cast himself as Meghan's protector, the man willing to walk away from centuries of royal tradition to shield her from the institutions and media he believed had destroyed his mother. He had staked his reputation, his family ties, and his future on the belief that Meghan was worth every sacrifice. But as the raid unfolded before his eyes, and as the discovery of sketches and prototypes exploded across headlines, Harry found himself caught in a trap with no obvious escape. He was no longer just a husband defending his wife from gossip. He was a man watching the woman he loved face accusations of theft, deceit, and betrayal on a global scale. Eyewitnesses who saw Harry during the raid described him as pale and withdrawn, a man carrying the weight of 1,000 unsaid words. He did not shout at the officers or interfere with their work, but his silence was louder than any protest. This silence continued in the days that followed, a silence that became its own kind of statement. For a man who had once rushed to defend Meghan at every turn, whether through interviews, documentaries, or explosive memoirs, his refusal to immediately speak up struck many as telling. Was it because he was shaken by what the police found? Was it because he did not know the full truth himself? Or was it simply because he realized that words, this time, would not be enough? Harry's dilemma was a collision between his personal devotion and the cold reality of the accusations. On one hand, he had built his post-royal identity around standing by Meghan, often to his own detriment. On the other hand, the evidence being paraded across television screens and newspapers was concrete in a way that gossip and rumor had never been. He could dismiss tabloid speculation about Meghan's behavior with the royals as bias or lies. But how could he dismiss the existence of sketches, prototypes, and police warrants? For Harry, this was no longer a fight against abstract enemies. It was a fight against the tangible weight of evidence. Inside their Montecito home, Tension reportedly escalated in the days after the raid. Friends of the couple spoke of heated arguments, moments where Harry's frustration boiled over. He wanted answers, clarity, reassurance that the sketches were not what they appeared to be. Meghan, according to some insiders, insisted that the situation was being twisted, that she had been framed or misrepresented. She clung to the narrative of being targeted, arguing that powerful forces in both the royal family and the fashion industry wanted to destroy her. For Harry, these explanations may have offered temporary comfort, but they did not erase the images of evidence boxes carried out of their home, nor the headlines branding Meghan as a copycat. The public reaction to Harry's silence only deepened his dilemma. Critics accused him of cowardice, saying his refusal to publicly defend Meghan revealed cracks in their marriage. Supporters urged patience, arguing that his silence was strategic, that he was waiting until the truth could be fully revealed. But for Harry himself, the silence was more personal than political. He was torn between the instinct to protect his wife and the growing fear that he might be defending something indefensible. This internal conflict weighed heavily on him, turning a man once known for his fiery outbursts into a figure of quiet, tortured restraint. The accusations also reopened old wounds for Harry. Throughout his life, he had watched how scandal and rumor destroyed his mother, Diana. He had spoken endlessly about how the press hounded her, how the institution failed her, how lies and half-truths shaped the narrative of her life. Now, with Meghan at the center of a global scandal, those memories came rushing back. He saw echoes of his mother in the way Meghan was being vilified, but he also saw something new and more troubling. Concrete allegations that could not be dismissed as mere press fabrication. Was Meghan truly a victim like Diana, or had she crossed a line that even he could not protect her from? In private, Harry's closest confidants speculated that he felt trapped. If he defended Meghan too forcefully and she was later proven guilty, he would look foolish, his credibility destroyed forever. If he failed to defend her and she was innocent, he would appear weak, a husband unwilling to stand by his wife. Either path led to damage. The only choice left was silence, but even silence became its own weapon, twisted by commentators as evidence of guilt or marital strain. Harry's dilemma was not just about what to say. It was about the impossible position he found himself in, a position that left him damned if he did and damned if he didn't. The strain on his marriage was undeniable. Sources claimed that Meghan felt betrayed by Harry's hesitation. She wanted him to come out swinging, to declare publicly that the sketches meant nothing, that she was innocent, that the raid was a setup. But Harry, ever cautious in this moment, refused to be her mouthpiece until he understood the full scope of what they were facing. This refusal reportedly led to arguments that stretched late into the night, with Meghan accusing him of faltering in his loyalty and Harry begging her to see the bigger picture. Their bond, once portrayed as unbreakable, now seemed to be fraying under the weight of a scandal that demanded more than love. It demanded answers. The royal family's silence added another layer to Harry's torment. He knew, perhaps better than anyone, that behind palace walls, the raid was being seen as vindication. For years, he had insisted that leaving the monarchy was the right choice, that Meghan was unfairly persecuted, that they were building something stronger and freer together. Now, with Meghan accused of stealing from Balenciaga, those arguments rang hollow. He imagined the whispers in Buckingham Palace corridors, the smirks of courtiers who saw the scandal as proof that Harry had chosen poorly. This thought alone must have tormented him, reopening the wounds of betrayal and rejection that had defined his split from the royals. In the public sphere, Harry's dilemma also became symbolic of larger questions. What does loyalty look like in the face of scandal? How far should love go in defending someone accused of wrongdoing? For many, Harry was a mirror reflecting their own moral struggles. Do you stand by the person you love unconditionally, or do you draw a line when evidence suggests betrayal? His silence, his grim expressions, his visible weight loss in the weeks after the raid, all became fodder for endless debates about the limits of loyalty and the price of love. The most tragic aspect of Harry's dilemma was that he seemed to lose no matter what. By standing by Meghan, he risked becoming complicit in her downfall, his name forever tied to hers in disgrace. By stepping back, he risked losing her trust and unraveling the marriage he had sacrificed so much to protect. For a man who had built his adult life around defying his family and choosing love above duty, this was a cruel twist. The very foundation of his new life, the belief that Meghan was his partner in truth and integrity, was now under siege. By the end of this chapter, Harry's dilemma stands unresolved, a knot of love, loyalty, fear, and suspicion that cannot easily be untangled. He is caught in the eye of a storm he cannot control, watching as the woman he loves is accused of one of the most damaging scandals in fashion history. His silence speaks volumes. His hesitation reveals the depth of his conflict, and his weary face tells a story of a man torn between the instinct to protect and the need to know the truth. Inside the walls of Buckingham Palace, news of the raid landed like a thunderclap. For an institution obsessed with control, image, and the preservation of dignity, the sight of police officers hauling evidence boxes out of Meghan Markle's California home was more than a scandal. It was humiliation by association. Though Meghan and Harry had formally distanced themselves from the monarchy years earlier, the ties were impossible to sever. The world still saw them as royals, still linked Meghan's name to the House of Windsor, and now, that name was being dragged through international headlines alongside accusations of fashion theft. The silence from the palace was immediate and absolute, but silence did not mean indifference. Behind closed doors, fury was brewing. The royal family had long considered Meghan an unpredictable force, someone who disrupted the rigid traditions that had carried the monarchy for centuries. Her marriage to Harry had been seen as a bold move at first, a symbol of modernity. But her later departure, and the interviews and accusations that followed, were perceived by many courtiers as betrayal. Now, with police raiding her home and finding alleged Balenciaga sketches, palace insiders described a sense of grim satisfaction mingled with deep embarrassment. This was, in their eyes, confirmation of what they had always feared, that Meghan's ambition would one day cross a line that would disgrace not only herself but anyone tied to her. The Queen, had she lived to see this moment, might have urged restraint, reminding the family that dignity lay in silence. But under King Charles, the tone was different. Courtiers whispered that Charles felt vindicated, that this was proof Meghan had never truly respected the values of the crown. To him, the raid was not just about fashion theft, but about character. A future queen consort, Camilla, reportedly viewed the scandal with barely concealed disdain, shaking her head at what she saw as the inevitable result of Harry's choices. And Prince William, already estranged from his brother, was said to be both furious and quietly relieved. Furious because the scandal tainted the family name, relieved because it strengthened his argument that Harry and Meghan's path was destructive. The fury inside the palace was not expressed in statements, but in whispers and actions. Advisors began drafting contingency plans to handle the fallout if Meghan attempted to tie the monarchy back into her defense. They feared she might claim the sketches were planted by forces connected to the royal family, painting herself once again as the victim of institutional persecution. For the palace, this was a nightmare scenario. They had spent years trying to separate themselves from Meghan's controversies, to show the public that her behavior was hers alone. Now, with her name trending globally alongside accusations of stolen designs, the risk of being dragged back into her orbit felt unavoidable. Behind the fury was also fear. The monarchy is built on symbols, and its strength lies in perception. Every scandal chips away at the public's trust, and while Meghan was no longer a working royal, her marriage to Harry tied her forever to the Windsor brand. Images of police cars outside her home reflected poorly on the entire institution. For monarchists, it was shameful to see a duchess, even a former one, associated with such allegations. For Republicans, it was fuel for their argument that the monarchy itself was outdated and prone to scandal. The royal family's silence, therefore, was not apathy. It was a calculated effort to contain the damage. Fury also simmered in the generational divide. Older royals, steeped in tradition, saw Meghan's scandal as proof of the dangers of straying from the rigid protocols that had guided the monarchy for centuries. Younger members of the family, including Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie, who had once sympathized with Harry and Meghan, reportedly pulled back in private. To them, the accusations of stealing Balenciaga designs were not simply tabloid fodder. They were concrete, damaging, and impossible to ignore. Even those who had once defended Meghan grew silent, unwilling to risk their reputations by aligning with her in such a moment. The press offices inside the palace became war rooms. Every headline, every news cycle was monitored with surgical precision. Courtiers debated whether to issue a statement distancing the monarchy from Meghan, but the risks of doing so were immense. A statement would make the palace appear defensive, as though they were taking sides. Silence, on the other hand, allowed the scandal to burn without their direct involvement. The choice was made to let silence speak for itself. But silence did not erase the anger, nor the whispers in private drawing rooms that Harry had brought disgrace upon them all. The fury of William in particular was said to be palpable. Already strained by years of conflict with his brother,